Well, guys, thanks for joining us once again. We are continuing our series in Jesus Where I'm At. We're going to take a little break from COVID, where we're at with COVID, to talk about where we're at in something that's happening in the news. But I want to start the conversation with a piece of scripture that I find myself going back to quite often. So Colossians 1:13 is this beautiful statement of the gospel that we have been delivered from the domain of darkness. That means that we have been rescued or freed or ransomed from the domain of darkness. It's the rule of darkness and the influence of darkness. We've been set free from that, and we've been transferred into the kingdom of the beloved Son, Jesus Christ. The gospel is not just about forgiveness of sins, although that is a huge part of the good news, is that we've been forgiven of participation and the consequences of living in this life. And we've been forgiven, but we've also been transferred and placed into a family, into a kingdom of people that are following Christ as the King. And as Christ people or Christians, we're constantly asking ourselves, how do we imitate Jesus where I'm at today? We talked early on in one of the teachings about improv, and improv is like acting out a character. And so another way of putting this is, how do we improv Jesus in the situations we find ourselves in today? And so I want to address one situation and talk about how we can improv Jesus in this particular situation. I don't know, maybe some of you have seen on social media the picture of a young black man that has been shot and killed. This was late February. His name is Ahmaud Arbery, and this happened in Georgia. 2 men have just been arrested for his murder, and they will be facing trial at some point. This is becoming too familiar, and to be honest, it's not a new situation. It's just that we have recording devices everywhere now, and so more of these situations where unarmed black men are being recorded, being shot and killed, it's become, unfortunately, too normal. So the question I have for us, and the question I want to help us lead through, is what do we do? If we're going to think about this in the Jesus way as Christians, or we're going to talk about it in the Jesus way, think about it, and even act, we need to put on Christ, is what Colossians says. Paul says in Colossians that we're going to strip off the old way of thinking and put on a new way of thinking, and I'm going to help us do that today. Obviously, there's books and volumes of books written about racism and the racial dynamic in our country, and I don't suppose that in the next 10 minutes I can sort all of that out for us. But I can give us, I think, 3 or 4 little steps to say, how do we engage in the conversation in a Jesus way as we put on Christ as those that have been brought to this new kingdom? And I want to start with a familiar teaching. And for me in my journey and having these conversations, this I feel like has been one of the most helpful places to start. And it's the story of the Good Samaritan. If you're not familiar, I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to bring out kind of 4 points from this story that Jesus told. And then we're going to talk about how we can apply that to Ahmaud's story today. I'm going to read out of Luke 10, starting in verse 30. Jesus tells this story to explain what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, and they beat him up and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, and when he saw the man lying there, he crossed the other side of the road and he passed by him. A temple assistant walked over and looked at the man lying there, but he also passed to the other side of the road. And then a despised, kind of a despicable Samaritan, one of those people, came along. But when he saw the man, his heart felt compassion for him. And he went over to him, and the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them up. Then he put him on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of the man. And the next day he handed the innkeeper 2 pieces of silver coin, telling him, "Take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than these coins that I'm giving you, the next time I'll see you, I'll pay the difference." Then Jesus looks at the crowd and he says, "Now which one of these would you say was a neighbor to the man that was attacked by the bandits?" And one of the men replied, "The one who showed mercy." That's the one that helped him. And Jesus said, yes. Now go do the same. Jesus is describing the greatest commandment in this new kingdom of Christianity, the way of Jesus. And he gives these kind of step-by-step pieces of this story that I think we can learn a lot from. The first thing is, he says, the Samaritans saw him. And so there is something about seeing somebody, and sometimes, to be honest, our instincts are to look away. Like, I don't want to click on that video and see that horrific scene, or I don't want to see that mom who's crying, and so I just want to look away, and if I look away, I can cross the other side of the street, I can keep on going with my life. And that's kind of a defense mechanism that we use to protect ourselves from having to be emotionally involved with a lot of the brokenness in the world. We just simply turn the channel. And so the first thing is, the Samaritan looks at him. And the second thing is, as he looks at him, his heart goes out to him. The word that is used is compassion, but it literally means that his heart went to the man. And so there's this feeling of compassion and empathy towards him. He's moved, and he's moved not just to feel, but he's moved to actually go towards him. And as he goes towards him, he arrives at him and he assesses the needs. There are wounds that need to be bandaged. There's clothes. He needs to be clothed. He needs a place to sleep. He needs food. And he begins to show mercy or help him by meeting the needs of the person. This, I feel like, is our go-to. See people, allow our hearts to feel for them, move towards them, not away from them. And then the last thing is meet needs, like in a real practical way, minister to them. And so as we look at Ahmaud Arbery and we look at not only his family and his mother, who is obviously grieving and mourning and crying out for justice, there's a whole community of people that are broken over this thing. I think our response has to begin with the Jesus way. And the Jesus way is not to begin to talk about logistics and who did what and why this and all of this. We need to start by looking at the family and looking at the community. And when we put ourselves in their shoes, like, what if it was my son that was jogging and was gunned down? What if it was someone from my community? How would that feel? And as you look at them and look at their faces and imagine the scene with people that you know and love, it's not hard for your emotions to get involved and your heart to go out to these people. Again, this is just the starting place, looking and not turning the channel. And as we look and our hearts get engaged, we move towards the situation. Now, obviously, it's really hard for us to move towards the situation all the way in Georgia, but there is certainly friends and minorities, and specifically people in the African American community that you can move towards during this time and to minister help. So as you do that, here's one of the mistakes that I've learned from watching and maybe even, but from doing, is that when we move in with words. We want to help them by explaining things, or we want to help them by giving a perspective. And I want to just say that in this story that Jesus tells us, it's very clear what the needs are. That this man's wounds need to be healed, like I said, that he needs to be fed and put in a bed. In this situation, it's not really clear what we are to do. And so we need to be good listeners. When Black Lives Matter movement started and there was all these videos that were coming out, I moved towards my African American friends and asked them, hey, from your perspective, help me. How can I be a part of the solution? And being humble as a listener to listen to their experience. And from that, I've really learned 3 things that have come up time and time again. Every time I have this conversation, I feel like one of these 3 things comes up. And I really feel like this is a way that we can love this community as we engage in the conversation. And the first one is to listen. Is that your friends from the African American community have stories of how they have experienced racism. Just in these conversations that I'm having with parents of Black teens and Black children, they're talking about the lessons that they're teaching their kids and where not to be and how not to be alone and not to go at night and don't wear a hoodie at this point. And they're all conversations that I'm not having with my kids. There's a privilege and a security that I have that I don't need to worry about my son jogging down the street and somebody thinking that he's a criminal. And so as you want to minister to your friends, be a listener. And just one of the things they want is, at least my friends have told me, is to listen to their experience. And I've learned a lot, and my eyes have been opened to a lot from just listening to the things that have happened in my friends' lives. And the second thing after listening is they've expressed to me, we want you to mourn with us. So a lot of times the Black community has watched these videos and suffered watching the videos, and they're crying and they're grieving and they're mourning. To go back to last week's lesson, they're lamenting. And yet their white brothers and sisters are distant, and they're talking about facts, and they're talking about all of the details of the case, but never engaging emotionally in mourning with them. So we're called as the Jesus people to weep with those who weep. So not only are we going to go and be listeners and to hear them, we're also going to join them in their mourning and grief. The fact that Ahmad's mom was celebrating Mother's Day this year without her son is tragic, and it should make us mourn and grieve and cry with them. And the third thing that I've heard time and time again is that we would love you to love us by speaking up for us. When there are things in the world that don't match up with the kingdom of God, we have to agree with Jesus and his vision for justice and harmony in our world and point out to the world that that situation is not right. And so many times it's the Black community that is crying out for justice as they lament, and the white community is silent. And so we need to be people who are willing to speak out against injustice when we see it. And thank God that the video was released and there was a public outcry for justice, and 2 men were arrested that will face trial for murder. And because people are willing to join the Black community and speak up with them. I know some of this conversation is hard and there's like a us versus them, but the reality is, in response to situations like this, too often there is an us versus them. And this needs to be, as the Jesus people, this is a we experience. We listen to them, and we mourn with them, and we speak with them. So I hope in some of the confusion of all the situations that will unfold like this in our country, and not just around race, but around everything where people are hurting, is that we will remember the Good Samaritan, that we're to see people, let our heart be engaged with them, move towards them, and then show mercy to them or help them. And I really pray that that is like the essence of our Dwell community, that we take on this Jesus way, and we're seen in a way of a people that are compassionate and helpful for those people that are hurting.